Paul Oakley. I'm Lighting Art Director at Epic Games. I'm here to talk about the Lighting of Battle Royale in Fortnite. So just to talk a little bit about myself and my experiences. I come from about 10 years in visual effects, and then after that about 10 years in Pixar animation, lighting, compositing, and then most recently as marketing art director and finally lighting art director for Fortnite and some of the other products. Today I want to talk about this lengthy agenda, but it's kind of broken into 4 major or specific areas, right? We're going to start with like art as reference and inspiration, what Fortnite lighting looks like in Battle Royale, and the style of it. And then we're going to talk about lighting tech and tools and tips, and then finally using those tools and tips and techniques and creating diverse biomes and POIs within the landscape of the Fortnite Island. So just as a show of hands, very quickly, who has heard of the Day Sequence Actor? Okay, that's pretty decent. Who's heard of Day Sequence Collection? Okay, that's less. Who's heard of Day Sequence Volumes? That's even less, so that's good. So maybe we can all learn something today. So I wanted to start off with artistic thought in lighting. It's very much a kind of abstract rambling about what I think is important and what I use for reference and inspiration when making lighting and art. You know, like I think one of the first things I would say is for your primary source of reference and inspiration, don't just use like Pinterest or AI, right? You'll only ever kind of get what you put into it back, regurgitated to you. You know, so for example, if you use, you know, a sword plus a knight plus a horse plus a castle, you can either only going to get back a fantasy kind of like, you know, medieval period imagery, but if you combine that with like disparate elements, you know, you'll get something unique and diverse. The other thing is don't just rely on using CG or your peers or the industry you work in as your benchmark for visual reference. Try to use everything outside of that as well. You know, everything from film, photography, painting, sculpture, poetry, books. Like there's a wealth of stuff right there in front of you. You know, use the real world as reference, your experience, your day-to-day stuff, your past history. Use that as an experience in your art. And try to use, you know, CG as the benchmark for quality of execution, not for the tone and mood of the images that you want to create. So this is titled Being an Artistic Detective, and for my informative years and even now and up to today, you know, I try to look at the why. You know, the why does this image matter? What does it achieve and why is it important? You know, I try to use history as a tool and my personal experience of like kind of what came before me as a tool to create like more unique things other than what is just culturally sort of in vogue at this point in time. You know, be curious about what came before as well in terms of like our history. I think that's incredibly important. I mean, I like to try to, like one of the most important things about being a lighting artist for me is to have the visual muscle to break down an image and understand the what's and the whys. Why is this important and what does it achieve? You know, I like to go to an art gallery, sit on a seat in front of a painting and spend like an hour breaking down why this image is successful, what does it achieve, and the fundamental techniques that went into creating that as a great image. This, I think, is a fair statement to make, right? Like, nothing is really new. It's like how we combine them together that makes them ours. Fortnite style, I think, is a great example of like the juxtaposition of known things, but in an uncommon way to create the new. I think it does a great job of that across its stylization, across its shape language, across its albedos. You know, the kind of list goes on. Just to finish the first portion, I think this summarizes the kind of thing that I was trying to get at, and it's like, this quote is I think very interesting from the point of view that I think it reflects, you know, and involves the internalizing of the external world and then expressing it through the writers or the artist's unique perspective and creativity. So in this next section, I'd like to talk about fine art painters in history. Like, I consider fine art painters to be like the OG CG artists of our time. You know, their understanding of material response and its relationship to light, I think, is phenomenal, considering they didn't, you know, have computers, digital pixels, or any of those things. You know, I think they benefited from the fact that painting was, you know, laying down paint and being sort of very methodical is a deliberate process in really identifying what's important. It allows it to slow down. You know, CG can be a trap at times because you can tear through work very quickly, especially with the technology we have today. So I would say consider the things that you do and the decisions you make before deciding that they're final. So here are just some very quick examples of some pieces of art that I think display some really interesting concepts. So contrast versus light, focus and attenuation. Right? Sometimes less is more, right? Don't mix light sources to create flatness in the image. Always kind of get gradients and allow light sources to breathe within the frame. Like, also edit. Like, that's, I think, a key thing. Is there was a great talk just before mine in the next room, and they were talking about lighting, and simplification of light, I think, is the most powerful thing. Bring the drama using shadows as a character, right? You can create contrast by using shadows and value shifts. Like, this produces depth in the image. You know, you don't necessarily need height fog to do Z-depth cueing. You can do it using shadows to contrast and create value shifts. Shadows can also be an environment character. You can use them to guide the eye in gameplay. Color complexity and the shape of ambient color. So in terms of like directional sunlight and then skylight, which is ambient shape and form, I consider the hardest thing to create in a lit piece of work is the ambient section of the image, to create shape, form, and color transition. You can do this using GI, but I think getting a well-balanced skylight is the first step in the equation. Also, color complexity and horizontal gradients. From right to left, you move from blue to warm. That's a combination of GI bounce, screen left, but also the attenuation of that light source and how you allow the ambient to play into areas of the scene. So guiding the eye using value, right, and the promise of more. So you'll have to bear with me, but I think a great tool for gameplay and creating a story arc is the idea of like less, leaving a lot of things to the imagination of the viewer. You can see the geometric light shaft move off to screen right, and I think that for me tells a story of guiding the eye, but it also tells me a story of like what's out that window. I want to see more, I want to know more. I've not modeled it, I've not put it into the scene, but I think it's placed there to guide the eye. Another example, like it's a great Edward Hopper piece. It tells the same story. It has like geometric light shafts to guide the eye from left to right. And it promises something more than what you can see directly in front of you. Here's also another example of that. And this is another example of the power of like limited hue range. Like draw the eye and create sophisticated moments in time. Feel the drama. Like who's that character in the red? You get to create tension through that colour, as well as guiding the eye through that colour. Okay, so now we move on to like Fortnite Battle Royale's visual lighting style. Okay, what is that? I mean, it means different things to different people. But like for me, the island is the biggest character. You know, the dynamic time of day system used as a colour and character arc for the island, I think is incredibly important for Fortnite as a brand. The appealability through vibrancy of colour palette is like essential. It's animated, it's more like an animated feature than a photoreal kind of piece of work. It has variation and is not consistent, so you have variation all through the island as you play as a character. And we'll talk more about the concept of variation right towards the end when we get into the volume side of things. Light it and save the gradient for visual difference, right? Like balance light, balance skylight, balance directional light, get local exposure correct and have the dependent relationship to be solid before you use, that includes tone mapping, but before you start changing and grading post-process volume heavily, right? You've got to like have a stable foundation to start with. And then colour, and more colour. Here is an example of the dynamic 24-hour time of day cycle. Now I'm just going to churn through a bunch of slides just to kind of give some visual relationship to the things I talked about in the beginning slide. So vibrant, not drab, you know, punch the colour, green grass, blue skies, you know, and let like that colour complexity kind of sing through. Here's an example of like, we did a Star Wars integration recently, but this is an example, if I refer back to the fine art slides, of like the power of limited hue range, and like drawing the eye directly to the singular part of the colour wheel that moves into red, everything else is on the opposite side. The dynamic time of day, right, can be fixed and locked. For example, for this POA, it is. And you can create like striking, unique moments. Another example of vibrant, not drab. Another example of limited hue range. I mean, I don't know if you can see, but there is a regen bus over to the left, and then there's a super rare chest over there. I don't know, place Fortnite, but they're both incredibly blue, and hopefully they stand out. And this is an example of a promising more. So this was a POI of a season recently introduced, and it's called Prime City, and we're going to delve into this a lot more a bit later in the presentation. But like this has the promise of more. It has like the concept of cards and fog and illumination. You come from side streets. You know, you want to kind of like embed yourself in the environment down deep at play a high level and like kind of move through these promises of like experiential moments. And like preserve local colour through lighting. So when I talk about using a fine balance and not grade your way to success early on, you'll get a lot more bang for your buck from all the disciplines you work with, from like modelling, from effects, from environment, to everyone. Those albedos will be represented beautifully, and the relationship of that with light will sing far better. Okay, what is the time of day system? So, time of day system internally on Fortnite, for example, is a combination of three things. It's the day sequence plugin or day sequence actor, which we have customized for our own purposes, but the day sequence plugin is available in UE, so that is used. Then there's something called the day sequence collection, which is injected into the day sequence actor, which we'll get onto more in a minute. And then there's day sequences, which are ingested by sequencer that create animatable times of day changes to all parameters within inside of the day sequence actor. Okay, so this is Fortnite's Battle Royale's lighting setup. So we have a few things that vary differently from that of the day sequence plugin that should be doing. We have an island skydown material that is heavily modulated to achieve the visual look of Fortnite and its vibrancy, especially for the sky and the relationship to Sky Atlas. We have a custom day sequence collection. We have baked clouds, and we have this custom day sequence actor. The day sequence collection is used for injecting scalability across platforms, which I'm going to get into a bit more in a bit. And then using sequence to animate parameters to visually change the time of day over 24 hours. Okay, let's start with sky day material, because this is like uber awesome and uber important, and What's great about being a lighting artist is I get to work with all these different disciplines and departments, and one of them that is incredibly important to the success of lighting is like the tech art department. So with the tech art department's help, we created this kind of custom bespoke, sky dome material. So it artistically supplements the sky atmos that is physically plausible. It has additive colour using masks in the sky dome that are animatable for sunset, sunrise moments where the sky atmos at acute vectors of sun direction tend to limit the coloration to that more of a physically plausible setup. But we're Fortnite and we don't want physically plausible, we want something incredibly expansive in the colour range. And then use the material parameters to animate changing values and colours in the sequencer. So here's the examples, right? So this is stripped back to what you would get just using a default sky atmos. The clouds are the baked ones that we'll talk about in a bit, as well as the volumetric stuff. That already has the material parameters customized on them. So you'll have to push that to one side, but just look at the sky dome as is. So this is the physically plausible sky atmos pre the additive masks. So this is color additive 1, which is a broad blue value shift to allow the sky still to be vibrant while still maintaining that low vector of the sun direction. Then we have some halo color. I'll just flick back and forward for a second. This has a squash and stretch animatable parameter, so as it transcends from sort of a higher 25-degree angle, it starts squashing and simulates that concept of band. And then we add some sun bloom colour to it. And this is the day sequence actor, materials or parameters set in sequencer, represented in the sequencer with the keyable moments on a 24-hour period. So you see, colour additive is the sun direction, colour additive 2 is the opposite hemisphere of the sun, which we didn't show visually, but it is there. And then we have the halo colour and the sun bloom, same sun bloom colour as well. And you can see how it ramps from night all the way through dawn, into midday, and then out to dusk, and then back into night. Okay, the day sequence actor. What is the day sequence actor, right? It is basically a blueprint for implementing sequencer-based day and night cycles with focus on simplifying environment lighting setup in the engine. The custom DSA also allows for control of the look on various platforms as well. Basically, in the short, a day sequence actor is a bunch of embedded components that create the final look. So this is the variation of our day sequence actor to the day sequence plugin. It's got 5 core components. That is basically the directional light, the sky dome, sky atmos, skylight, and the post-process. All of these things, especially like sky atmos, sky dome, directional light, skylight, they all have symbiotic relationships, and one affects the other quite greatly. So that's when I talked earlier on before about you need to light it before you grade it, because if you try to grade your way to success, sky atmos and its relationship to directional light will break down very quickly. This also has multiple post-processors for scalability, for bloom and exposure. Has the custom sky dome material in here as well. It has baked clouds, which is different. It also has the 24-hour cycles driven in sequencer. So let's talk about this first. So this has an animation here of the directional light. We lock it off at a 15-degree angle, so we always maintain the semblance of directional light and ambient light, so we always preserve shape and form on the island play space. This helps gameplay, readability, it helps, the concept of this being, fundamentally a tactical shooter game. I think it helps a lot, even though it is physically unplausible at times. We also have a single directional light for moon and sun. So, okay. So the next bunch of slides, screen left will be the final output, and the screen right will be with that particular component deactivated. So the difference between that left and right is, the animated Rayleigh absorption and colour are removed, the animated Rayleigh distribution and the animated global absorption levels are changed. And the same again for Sky Dome. We talked about the additive colour masks. Left and right, if you didn't have them, you'd get them on the right. Skylight, this maintains a constant intensity in FMBR, right, to balance everything. The colour is sampled directly from the Sky Dome. Something unique we do, which I think is incredibly important, because our skies are so saturated, we actually use a reflection to saturation node and look up at the Sky Dome to kind of like take off like maybe 5–10% saturation of the sky fill levels. And then post-process, it's really minimal changes. It's all driven with that real-world symbiotic relationship that I talked before about. It really mainly controls exposure and histogram. And then baked clouds. This was a huge advancement done by the tech art team. We'll talk about this in a second actually in detail, but this exists on all the platforms. Everything from Epic High all the way down to mobile, so it's like a massive win. And here's an example of the bake cloud lighting direction. Basically, it's faking volumetric clouds into custom cards. We bake out 7 light directions. We use noise to displace the shape, displace the shape language. It works on all platforms. That's massive. You can see here in the 7 directions, it's like front left, front right, top, back left, back right, back. These were all taken and baked into channel packing, and then these images are, the colours here are then used to control the animated material parameters in the sequencer. So, you remember when I first showed you the sequencer slide with the animatable masks? We do the same for this, and we colorise it based on sun direction, ambient levels, rims, based on the time of day. Here's an example of final clouds. It's baked into channels and then controlled using those material parameters I mentioned. It's highly effective, right? Okay, day sequence collection. Right. The day sequence collection is a powerful collection of sequences balanced by bias and using conditional tags to toggle them on or off. And this is based on platform INI profiles. It's visually represented in sequencer. And you can easily block what is on and what is off based on platform, or based on these biases and conditions that are active at the time. So I want to go through this in kind of detail because it's uber powerful. So it's a custom data asset, right? It has an array of day sequence entries. So for all of these, you can see, and we'll go into a bit more detail on a closer slide, but you can see all of the sun root position animation of that is the top node. The second node is basically the look dev for the whole island. And then as you transcend down the stack, it represents a multitude of different scalabilities. A track stack can be active based on bias and priority and based on conditional tags. So here's a close-up, right? You can see, for example, the DSBR-CH6S1. I know it's a super catchy name, but that's Chapter 6, Season 1, BR, lighting base. And then the next, and that's set to a bias of 101, right? And then the next one is the same thing, but GI off. So when that conditional tag that is highlighted there is met, then that will turn on, and it will override the base island based on its bias of priority. And now you can do that all the way down the chain. There's conditional tags for mobile, there's conditional tags for GI off, medium, etc., etc. Here's an example of the result of those collections represented in sequencer. So the highlighted tracks are the ones that are active. So these contribute towards the base island setup. And then you can see all the ones in the middle. They're the additional ones included in the collection that can be activated based on the conditional text. Here's a visual representation of that flow. So here is the base island sequence lighting setup with no conditional tags for day sequences activated. And if you look at the top, that's a sequencer. You look at the next image, that is you jumping into one of the sequencer tracks that are active, showing you all the variation and modulation that's been created to create the final look. And there's a picture of what the final look at, like epic high. Here is GI medium. So you can see the fact that GI medium has been activated. These are overrides within that one day sequence that then create a different look. Like, this is uber powerful, especially when thinking about like the rendering features of different platforms. You can like fake, like when you start getting, and walls falling down platforms, and you start losing shadows on directional lights, you start losing like ambient occlusion, or from skylight, you know, that leaks through, and you've just got directional plus skylight, no ambient occlusion, zero shape, like on mobile. You can go in here, and you can be like, okay, my skylight and my directional light, those ratios are kind of like, they were set at the high level for Epic. Now they can just, I can't see anything, it's too bright, there's no form or shape. You could lower that skylight level, keep the directional, or vice versa. Introduce maybe gamma as like a post-process to fake the concept of like some sense of occlusion. So this is like uber powerful for like look development for platforms. Here's an example of mobile. So I'm just kind of trying to really drum in, these things get activated based on the collection. You set a bunch of stuff in the day sequence, and it, you know, it gives you a different output. Excuse me. This is a slide to try to break down that relationship between the day sequence actor. It gets, you know, you inject a collection into it, and then you get, and that collection references sequences, like day sequences, and also scalable sequences. The bottom part in purple is the one we've not touched, and we're about to touch that in a couple of seconds. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, I'll continue. Okay, unique POIs and biomes. This is where it gets even more interesting, and this kind of represents that purple section at the bottom. You know, day sequence volumes, this is what this represents, is a massive game changer in creating visual diversity across our island in Fortnite. The volume can inject procedurally generated sequences, or it can use created sequences in day sequence, actor at runtime. These sequences can be enabled and disabled and weighted dynamically during gameplay. So let's talk about how to create one of these things, right? Like, first of all, you need to create a day sequence modifier or a day sequence volume. These exist as like spatial chord-based systems that you can give a shape to. And like in detail, this is actually some of the parameter lists of it. So what you do is you create a collision shape. Now, you could create anything. You can create a box, you can create a capsule, you can create a sphere. You can combine these as well as you go further along in these areas here. So you don't just have to have one, you can have a bunch of them. But I would encourage you to start with one and be as simple as possible for your play space. I would also encourage you to use capsules and spheres, because as you start combining them, if you use cuboid edges, you can get like very abrupt entry points and extra exit points as you transition through these volumes. So here it talks about the bias as well as the blend amount. Now, what's interesting is everything is based on priority. The higher the priority wins, right? So you need to make sure your volumes have a high priority of that and something else around it. Also the blend distance. That will eat from the outside of the collision sphere or collision object inwards. So that creates the ease of transition. And here you can add an override basically for your look, right? You can add a day sequence in here, and then set a bunch of parameters to create a visual difference. Or you can put in here a day sequence collection, which you can do the same with, but in the more complicated way I showed earlier. So you could say, I want this environment to be a very specific way, and I've realized that as I try and extend down the scalability, it starts looking terrible. So now I'll plug in a collection in here, and then I'll plug in day sequences into that collection to facilitate change across all of the platform scalabilities. You could also do a fixed time of day, which is kind of cool. And that's a real quick win if you have an animated time of day. So impact through diversity. So here is the use case in Crime City that I promised. So here is the video. So let me back out a second. Hold on. So let me introduce this video. So it starts on the outside of that volume. You'll transition through the blend into the volume. And the outside is the base island look, so it's the same, the same everywhere, and then the inside is the look depth for this one particular POI. You'll have to forgive that I used the mouse to capture this. Someone told me afterwards that an Xbox controller would be far better. Okay, so this example has locking the day sequence volume to a specific time of day. This also has the use of the day sequence collection injected into the day sequence volume that we talked about. And the day sequence collection is now overriding anything set in the day silence sequence. So let's strip it right back. Okay, so this is the base island setting, right? So this blue skies, very Fortnite, green grass, beautiful, beautiful. But it's not macabre and Crime City-esque. So then, this is the next portion. It's fixed time of day, okay, so we don't want the time of day to alter, we want it to be completely static, so we set it to night time. Then we start adding overrides to that day sequence, right, for this particular POI. And we go, and we want to introduce more volumetric clouds, high altitude as well as low altitude volumetric clouds. We want to start changing height fog, right? Denser, maybe more dispersion to it. We then want to fuss around with the sky, dome materials, punch light through the areas of light and dark and shadow, create form there. And then introduce sky atmos, right? Change sky atmos so it's more physically plausible to that, the foggy, dense environmental scene that we're trying to reproduce. Change the directional light. I mean, that's kind of a big deal. Add bloom, right? Let's start blooming out and pinging out these various elements. Post-process. I mean, that's used heavily at the end, but it's a great effect. Here's an example, and I'm not going to go through all these because there's quite a lot, but these are basically all the parameters that were changed to create that visual look from the island default setting. Great thing about this is locking fixed time of day doesn't mean you need to animate all of these over a 24-hour cycle. So before, and then after. So that volume is uber powerful. And I kind of want to end really by just stressing the power of this. It is, it's been a game changer, on the Fortnite Battle Royale island. We can have a multitude of POIs that exhibit different biome changes, differences, as well as character arcs within environment. And I'd like to finish by thanking a few people. We have the tech art team that I said we work hand in glove with, which is super important. We also have the time of day sequencer team that has gone and created all of these wonderful tools that we all work with. And fundamentally, being a lighting artist is a privilege because it does take a village to build and have impact. And I think working with modeling environment, effects, level design, all of that is the responsibility of a lighting artist to really kind of hone create great relationships with and create great communication with. So with that, I may be a little quick, but that's the end of my talk. But I'd love to hear comments or open it up for chat if anyone's got anything they'd like to ask.